From chasing after the way you love me, keeping me up 2 cups of coffee. Baby, you make me feel so lovely. I keep on running, no, I should've wanted a high. I keep on falling right into your thought, I can't get you off my mind. So sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Oh, what a rush each time you catch me. Chasing after the way you love me. Color my life up like confetti. Baby, you make me feel so lovely. I keep on running, no, I should've wanted a high. I keep on falling right into your thought, I can't get you off my mind. So sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Nothing out there could ever stop me. From chasing after the way you love me. Keeping me up 2 cups of coffee. Baby, you make me feel so lovely. So sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy. Sweet, yeah, I need it from you. Got my hands all on you, sweet. Everything I want is sugar like yes, please. Love is like candy.
Hey everybody, welcome to our special edition live on Friday.
Great to be live with you today. It's a great day.
So initially we had kind of planned of just straight up answering your questions, which we are going to do, but we can't ignore the fact that rent is
Late
due.
last night. Rent is actually due. Finally, rent is due, now. So obviously it's been a long couple years, almost 2 years for the landlords. So it was a nice win that we got last night, and now people can at least get their homes back, their rentals back. So
Exactly. So it's been great. So basically, if you didn't know what happened last night, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to end the moratorium. Pretty sure it ends immediately. Details haven't really come out 100% yet. But, we knew this was on shaky legal ground. We had discussed that before. So this isn't really a surprise. But what's nice is they rushed it through a lot faster than I think that we thought that they would. And so it's awesome for landlords,
yeah, and I think just to be fair, in the beginning, I think everyone was kind of like, okay, there's a lot of uncertainty around a lot of things. But since then, there's been a tremendous amount. I think $46 billion the federal government approved for rental assistance. There's been a bunch of money given in the form of stimulus and unemployment and all that. So the money has gotten into the renters' hands. And so there was a bit of frustration, obviously, when it kept getting bumped down the road.
Yeah, and this will be good for a lot of small landlords. It's the small landlords that really suffered during all this. I'm sure some of you have been suffering. I am curious if anyone feels like it should have been extended, to comment. This is very conversational.
Yep.
So I would love to know why if you do feel that way. So anyways, we're going to jump in and start answering some questions. We have some really good ones. If you guys notice that we have really good camera quality today. It's because the crew came out to Manhattan Beach for this week. So
Yeah.
props to Jerry and
They've
Jake.
been here all week filming.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with Jay. He's asking thoughts on purchasing property on land with a long-term lease. So basically like a land lease.
Yeah.
A land, a property with a land lease.
Sure. Yeah. So there could be some issues around financing. So, like I've been in a situation before where I was trying to actually buy a property, and it was a state land lease. So it doesn't really matter who owns it, but a land lease is a land lease. And it was difficult to get financed because obviously, it's not your traditional thing. But again, it just at the end of the day, it's they're fine. Depends on the length.
He said there's 75 years left, so
Okay.
it'd basically be his whole,
Yeah. Listen, if it's cash flows,
Yeah.
and it's a good deal, then I can't see a lot wrong with it. You really need to get into the details of the land lease itself. They're very different. And so you need to make sure that an attorney takes a look at that because there are, I've heard of horror stories in land leases. So you just want to make sure that's really looked at.
Yeah. And I mean, it is an additional expense, so it really does cut into your cash flow. He did mention that, the property is cheaper than the other properties that don't have them,
Yeah.
which makes sense. But you got to think how much cheaper and how much are you paying per month over 75 years? And does that make sense?
Right.
So Casey's question for you are, what do you look for when investing in REITs?
Sure. So a REIT is a real estate investment trust. It's a vehicle that you can invest in almost like a stock. So there are actually private REITs and public REITs. And so there are different kinds of REITs. There are non-traded REITs, there are open-ended REITs and closed-end REITs. And so so I'm going to assume that you're talking about something like off the shelf, like a Wall Street REIT. So each REIT is very different and they have different funds. So some REITs have what they call core funds, which would be, core like infill, downtown. Some have what they call value add funds. So, so you got to take a look at that. So a core would be, think of a, downtown corner apartment project or office building or something like that. A value add would be more along the lines of what we do, which is, something where you're buying it maybe in the rural area and you're putting a bunch of money into it. Now, the reason why I want you to start there, and I'll get into the rest, is because the money that the reason why they brand it that way is because that's where the money goes. So a core fund would be buying core assets. A value add fund would be buying, let's say, value add assets, and they're very, very different. Now, one is almost like a coupon. Like a core is almost like a coupon, essentially. At least it used to be pre-COVID. But now, the other thing is on a REIT, you might have a REIT that specializes in hotels. You might have a REIT that specializes in Class A hotels, or let's say those micro hotels. There could be very different. On the apartment side, you have REITs that specialize in Class A, and then you have REITs that specialize in value add. So, you have to kind of dig into all of that. So if you think about it, it's really this simple though. Let's say there's $100 million or $200 million of equity raised in one of these funds. You're going to match that up with $300 or $400 million worth of debt. So you might have, the REIT might be worth, let's say, $500 million. So you have to look at the assets inside of that because that's what's going to provide the return. So there might be 10 assets, there might be 20 assets, all inside of that REIT. That's what's going to actually determine obviously the return.
You don't love REITs though.
I personally don't. I think that it's a great way to get into real estate. However, on a less expensive basis, but you don't get the depreciation expense and all the benefits that a real estate investor gets. You don't get, obviously, because it's more like a stock play.
Yep, exactly. So let's jump back to the moratorium. So far, everybody is in favor of it, but if you're not, we really would like to hear from you. Kurt said, how do you see the ending of the eviction moratorium affecting the housing supply, if at all?
Great question. So it's what it's going to do. It's there are for sure going to be people that move around. Like, you know, that is for sure. So now people, you know, they have to, you know, the rubber's hitting the road right now. Like they have to. So people that have been kind of hiding behind this, let's say, and I want to point out the overwhelming majority haven't. Most people are paying. Most people are working with landlords. This is, you know, for the exception, in my opinion. You're going to have some vacancies, but I think the rental market right now, as I've talked about a lot, is it's very, very interesting. It's very competitive. So, you know, our properties are highly occupied. What I'm hearing are massive rent increases right now, and we're actually in a shortage. So this will be a temporary blip, in my opinion. There will be lots of people that owe lots of money. There's no question around that. But their ability to pay it is probably low. So what they're going to do is they're going to skip out, just like they do on a car payment or a medical payment or whatever, and they're going to try to figure that out later. You know, obviously it'll go on their credit, and it'll just be one more of those things.
But do you think it's going to affect the housing market? Like, do you think more houses are going to come up for sale? Do you see a dip in prices because of it?
Well, no, I don't. And the reason is, you know, think about it. We're talking about evictions now. If you own a house and nobody's paid for a while, you can now get somebody in there. So, and there might be, in some cases, obviously the landlord might have to sell, but I think they probably would have listed it already, you know?
Yep. Totally agree. And then rent is due. Love the name, by the way. This is a pretty funny question, actually. How do you handle a tenant with an emotional support pit bull?
Well, an emotional support pit bull. Well, I think so this is a contentious issue. You know.
Well, first let's explain to everybody what an emotional support animal is and what the laws are around that.
Yeah, and that's where I was heading. So, you know, it used to be kind of a, you know, the wild, wild west. So you used to be able to take a dog on a plane and, you know, and all these different things. And now you actually have to have a tremendous amount of paperwork. Mm-hmm. So you can't dispute paperwork. So if it's all registered and, you know, all that's happening, you have to accommodate. And that's just kind of the way it is. I think, and there are certain, you can go, if I were you, I'd go online, take a look and demand, you have to, just like the airlines started doing, because the airlines are a great example. It kind of got out of hand, where people were like, you know, this is my emotional support, you know, Boston Terrier, or
pit bull.
Yeah, and they would, yeah. So I remember talking to our friend, you know, and this guy brought like a big German Shepherd on the plane, you know.
Yep.
And you know, I'm not saying it was or wasn't an emotional support dog, but I think those loopholes are starting to close now through proper paperwork.
Exactly. So we had a good question. Oh, I just lost it. Oh, here we go. Okay, so Jason asked, so Ken, what is the REIT that MC Company represents? Or do you distance yourself from such a title and brand and make it your own fund? So he's basically asking how MC Company raises money.
Yeah. So we're not a REIT. So we've looked at doing that a lot. And it's always something kind of on our mind. And so it's a very, very different scenario. So when you go out and raise money like that, there are massively different implications for attracting capital. And there's also a fair amount of overhead associated with owning a REIT and running a REIT. So mostly on the compliance side and on the accounting side, because you know there's all this. It's basically public. So right now, what we're doing is we do everything through a what's called a Regulation D under the SEC, a Securities Exchange Commission, and we do it through individual PPMs or private placement memorandums. So we generate a business plan, and then we give it to the attorney, our securities attorney. And then they put together a PPM, and then we do a accredited investor only raises, and people go to our website, mccompanies.com. and they verify that they're accredited or not accredited. And they get on a list, and then we send the business plan to everyone on the list at the same time. So that's how we raise capital. So it's a little bit different than some people that actually put a fund together. So at this time, that's not what we do.
And so Wendy's next question is, she said, I have a question about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans. There seems to be a limit to the number of those loans you can get on investment properties. Are there any other alternatives? And she says aloha from Hawaii.
Yeah, well, great.
Aloha.
Yeah, so I've heard about this. I heard that they're starting to put limitations on these kinds of loans. I would love for people to weigh in on this. I'm not really experienced in this area because we're doing Freddie and Fannie Mac, or Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae all the time, and we haven't had this restriction. But I have heard people.
But you're on multifamily, so it could be different.
Yeah. But I have heard that there's some restrictions. Obviously, there are other options other than Freddie and Fannie. So clearly, that's a great option. There's a tremendous amount of people that will loan you money outside of that. One thing I just saw today, it was on the news feed, that this is actually good news for the Fannie and Fannie Mae is going to start allowing and looking at rent payments as part of the approval process for mortgages.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
that'll help a lot of people, be able
yeah.
to get some
a
loan.
that want to get a loan.
Right. So Teal Motors says, how do I get a loan how do I get a mortgage, I think is what he's saying, if my taxes are not that much? So I think what he's saying, he didn't claim much income, but he wants to get a mortgage. So what should he do?
Yeah, so obviously the mortgage lender looks at lots of things other than what you pay in tax. So they're going to look at your income streams. They're going to look at the property as collateral. They're going to look at the cash flow. They're going to look at, a number of things, even your assets. So, getting a loan is not easy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, especially now, they've kind of locked down a bit,
Yeah, and I used to work at a bank. I mean, in 2008, anybody could get a loan, and that was actually the part of the issue based on credit score. But now you really got to buckle down. I know as a business owner, we can write off a lot of the income. What I do, knowing that I'm going to buy properties, is about a year or two in advance. You just have to claim more income because they're going to base it on your debt to income ratio. And if you aren't showing the income, there's really nothing you can do.
I'll tell you, this is actually might surprise some of you guys, but every single deal I have is sitting in some LLC somewhere. And so I actually don't take a salary in my firm. So you can imagine, like, when I go out and try to buy, whatever I'm trying to buy, like, they're looking at me and they're like, you don't have any income. It's all sitting up.
Well, yeah, banks don't use logic. There's no logic. It's all a formula, and they really can't stray from that, especially your large banks.
Yeah, and when I say income, I mean W-2 income. So, obviously I have lots of income coming in other areas, but retail bankers have a heck of a time trying to wrap their head around investment income and passive income. But they are out there. I do know that. I've navigated it myself. But Ross and I my partner Ross, as you guys all know, we laugh about this all the time because we have so much rental income coming in passively. But we don't take salaries, W-2s out of because we pay a lot of tax in there, and we make most of our money tax free through the passive income we get.
Exactly. So Kurt has a really good follow-up question. He says, would you anticipate the rental competition to ease up considering an increase in the units available?
So I don't know that there will be. I think that it's going to get absorbed pretty quickly. And I don't know, so I'm involved in the National Apartment Association and the National Multi-Housing Council. And, we do have a kind of our finger on our pulse, at least for the multifamily side, but not necessarily as much on the single family side. I don't think you're going to see the supply like you think. And I think what's going to happen, I think it's a small percentage of people.
Yeah. It's not as big as the media is trying to blow it up that there's so many people that aren't paying rent, but that's just not what we're seeing on the ground here.
No. So the two properties I bought were, the ones in Houston, they were each about $250,000 in delinquent rent on pull. So call it $500,000 between 600 units. But it was all, think about this. There's 600, we'll call it 600 people living there out of 650. Most of them, I think it was like 20 or 30 people.
Right. So it's a very small percentage.
At 1,000 or 1,500 a month, right? So aggregated, it looked like a lot, and it was, but it was a small number, and we just put a deal in escrow in Austin last week, 455 units, same kind of issue. I think we have 350,000 in delinquents. So we're looking at this on properties that we're buying, and it is a number, but it's a small number. It's 5%.
Well, and this is why it's hurting the small landlord more than the major landlords, because somebody like Ken has so many properties that if a few people don't pay him, yeah, it sucks, but it's not going to shut down everything. Or somebody like me with 3 units, if somebody doesn't pay, that greatly affects me. I mean, luckily all my tenants have paid, but I'm just saying if you're a landlord that only has a handful or 1 unit and that person's not paying, you're in a lot more distress. So that's why this whole moratorium affected the small landlords more than the large ones.
Yeah. And this is really a win for the small landlord.
Yeah.
The big landlords, obviously, we're going to take a loss. There's no question. But we also have a lawsuit, actually. There's a lawsuit against the CDC, about this. So you can go to the NAA.HQ or NAAHQ.org and take a look and because of damages. So the small landlord is the one that's going to get their property back and hopefully save the properties.
Yeah, and a lot of these landlords too are just going to sell. If you're a small landlord and you've been through hell the last year, you're probably just going to list it. I actually had a girlfriend of mine tell me yesterday they're just going to list their property because they haven't been paid and they just don't want to deal with it. So, but then a lot of people are asking too on here is, do you think that they're going to try to extend the moratorium another way? And then one person even mentioned he just thinks the whole system's collapsing. So what do you have to say to those people?
So the interesting thing is this is a federal, issue. So the states and the cities can actually enact their own. So this absolutely positively that could happen.
Yeah.
But, it's not going to collapse anything, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. So Alex has a comment. He said that I just suggested fudging tax returns. And I want to address that because I didn't say that. So basically, as a small business owner, you are allowed to write off items against your income. So, if you make $100,000 a year and you start writing off items that you're legally allowed to write off, you can claim a smaller income. However, if you're trying to apply for a mortgage, you may not want to write those things off because then you can pay more tax and increase your income. So it's really not fudging it. It's just not taking all the write-offs that you're allowed to take by law.
Yep.
So just to clarify, John is asking, what would be better, a HELOC on my primary residence or a mortgage on a rental property?
So what I would do is I would use your HELOC to scoop the equity, making sure that you're not too levered on your primary, and I would use that as a down payment for a mortgage on a rental. So that's basically what you did.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I did. I always keep my home equity open so that I can make that down payment with the home equity, but then get the mortgage, the balance as a mortgage. Because the difference is the home equity, generally, I think they all are not a set rate. They're not a fixed rate. They're variable. And you don't want a large amount of money on a variable rate. That's going to move with inflation and not be good for you. What you want is that fixed rate debt. And so you really want the balance on a mortgage.
Yeah. The one thing is, I think you guys probably remember a couple months ago, Wells Fargo said no more HELOCs, right?
Yep.
They said, no more lines of credit, and which is an interesting move. And I think there was another bank too, was it JP Morgan? I can't remember. I might be wrong there. But the point is, they're harder and harder to get. So essentially, a HELOC is just a line. Remember, tax free because it's like a cash out refinance. But I think what Danille did is she used it as a down payment for her next place.
Property. And I still have it open. You know, I have a $100,000 line open so that I can go in and put a down payment on anything that cash flows. Yeah.
So I think it's just prudent to have. In fact, this is actually an idea that we had a couple of years ago. I told her, I said, I think you should go get lines of credit against all your equity. You don't have to draw on it. Just go get approved and have it sitting there. So it's like a pre-approval on your equity. Don't forget, it's on properties that you own. And then you have the ability to draw on it, based on whatever the rates are and the terms are at the time. But just get it all set up now so that when you are in a position and you need it, then you can go do it.
Exactly. Nicolay wants to know, what do you think is a good cash-on-cash return on rental properties?
So great question. So everybody, cash-on-cash is this. So let's say somebody gives me 10 grand and I give them back 1,000. That's a 10% cash-on-cash. That's how that works. So if I take 10,000 from an investor and my rental property produces 1,000 back, that means that they got a 10% cash on cash. Has nothing to do with mortgage paydown, has nothing to do with the depreciation or anything like that. It's literally cash on cash. So that's what cash on cash means. So as you're raising capital and you're starting to look at cash on cash, then you have to think about the investor or yourself or your family or whoever you're getting the money from. Where are you taking it from? If it's sitting in the bank at less than 1%, then getting a 3 or 4% cash on cash is actually better. It's not necessarily great, but it's better than 1%. And so you got to kind of take a look at how, what kind of rate is the money making. And so what we try to do is we try to target somewhere between a 7 and a 10% cash on cash if we can. And so that's always kind of our target range.
Yep. But you never promise anything.
No, you can't. I mean, real estate is fickle. People moving in, people moving out, things happen like pandemics, they happen. So, things can happen to, derail, your projections. And so, but that's a good range. When we're trying to buy something, that's what we're trying to target.
Okay. And then Kai said, Ken, you have a lot of units in Tucson and not in Phoenix. What is the reason for that? And is Tucson still a good place to invest?
Yeah, we actually do have a lot in Phoenix.
Yeah, I thought you did.
Yeah, but regardless, we have a lot in Tucson too. So what happened was we had a six property deal like 5 or 6 years ago that we bought from a group. And Ross and I, so that really put us heavily in Tucson, was that one purchase. So that group owned 6 properties. Now, obviously, when a group puts a number of properties, and I can't remember the number of units, but I think it's right around 2,000 units. And so Ross and I bought all 6. Oh no, there were 8. I'm sorry, there were 8. There were 8 properties, and so we bought all 8. And in addition to that, we had assets there already, and we've always enjoyed Tucson. So Tucson's very, very different than Phoenix. And interestingly enough, there's not a lot of new development in some of these smaller towns like Tucson. And so you don't have the supply issues that you might have in Phoenix. Right now in the Phoenix Greater Metro area, I think there are 30,000 units either planned or under construction. And in Tucson, that number is going to be, a couple thousand. So you have to kind of look at all of those things. The supply can easily disrupt operations. And so we love both markets. And they're very different. And, even Tucson, there are areas of Tucson that are rough, and there are areas of Tucson that are awesome. And but yes, we are kind of heavy in Tucson right now because of that big purchase.
And then Hunsicker wanted to know, how do you determine when it's the right time to sell an investment property that's paid off?
So, I think that the biggest thing that we look at when we're trying to sell a property is the passive income. So,
to start, you don't usually like to sell things.
We don't.
Sometimes you do.
Yeah.
But
So you got to take a look at what's the income? So I remember we had a big institutional group trying to buy our whole company a few years ago. And I met with a friend of mine. He's like, why would you get rid of the golden goose, which is all the, free cash flow we had coming in. We'd spent all this time buying all this stuff. And it would have been nice. Obviously, we would have got a lot of cash, Ross and I and all our investors. But then we would have cash. And then we'd have to, try to redeploy it and reinvest it through a series of, whatever. So we ended up walking away from that. But the other issue, so you really have to look at the free cash flow. And what does that mean to you? So if that property is providing $1,000 or $2,000 a month, don't forget that, right? And probably a lot of it tax free. The other piece of that is you have a capital gain and a depreciation recapture. So there's a big taxable event that a lot of people don't look at until after they sell. So we always look at what's our depreciation recapture. So what happens is you get depreciation each and every year. And then if you sell, that's all recaptured. And then you have that capital gain. And so, with the Biden administration, the capital gains are kind of a jump ball right now. Like there's a lot of stuff going on with tax. So, and then there's a lot of stuff on the table around step up basis and all kinds of stuff. Now I know this isn't necessarily a step up basis question, but you really, really need to look at the tax and is it worth it? Because you could net 50% of what that gain was.
Plus, what are you going to do with that money? Okay, so you said it's worth $380,000. So you have $380,000. So then are you just going to sit on it? Are you going to reinvest it? And what are you going to do with it? Because as we talk about a lot on this channel, inflation's going to eat away at that money if you just put it in the bank.
Right. That's the issue we always have is how much cash do you really want right now going into an inflationary period? I would suggest not much. You want to be liquid a little bit. You want to have some liquidity, but at the same token, I think you're better off to be in a hard asset right now. And if I were you, I would maybe put a small amount of debt on it.
Right.
And since you don't have debt, if you're comfortable and if it's covered.
Right.
And
when you say a small amount of debt, he means like a cash out refinance or a home equity line.
Yeah. Like 30, 40, 50% loan to value, perhaps. And then take that and reinvest it because we just closed yesterday on a refinance. Well, we locked, so we haven't actually closed yet, but we will at the end of the month. We locked and our rate is 2.2%, if you can imagine that. So I can already tell you that inflation is running well above that. So we're actually borrowing at less than inflation. So you got to take a look at the cost of money right now. And so if you sell out, pay your tax, and then you get that money, that becomes a liability. As I say, debt used to be a liability, but today cash is a liability. And debt is an asset. So it's the opposite of what it used to be, even though technically a CPA will argue with me and they'll be right. But I think cash is a liability.
Well, it is because it's going to be inflated away. And we just talk about that. I mean, as inflation goes up, any savings you have go down.
Yeah.
So we had a question. Oh, Brian, he is saying that he doesn't think you can get a HELOC for your rental properties, on your rental properties. And you can. So I've been looking into this. I've done it. You can do it. Usually you have to do it through the smaller banks. So people tend to call your big banks and just say, oh, we can't do it. A lot of your small local banks, they make their own rules and they will do it. Sometimes you do have to pay for the appraisal, unlike on your own personal residence. But other than that, they'll do it.
That's a good point, guys. I don't know if you realize how different banks can be. So if you go to a big buttoned up corporate bank, you're going to be met with roadblocks. Mm-hmm. Trust me. And there's a lot of these small local regional banks and even credit unions are very, very, very good places to go get money because money's money. It doesn't matter where you get it. It doesn't matter the name on the door. It's just money. And so then you look at the term. So I would suggest there's way more smaller regional banks than there are the big corporates. And go get a great relationship. We have done a lot of business this way with small regional local banks, specifically on the construction side. We've tried to get construction loans through, let's say, Wells Fargo. It's like a nightmare getting through, all the compliance and all the things that they want. And oftentimes we got a small little regional bank that just it's super easy. Like there's like a couple guys on the credit committee and, they're pushing it through and, we go have lunch with them.
Well, they can be more reasonable, like the big banks have never lent me money, even though I'm basically a really ideal candidate. They're just like, no, you're a business owner and we just would rather you be a W-2. I actually had the banker at Chase tell me if I go work somewhere for 6 months, even if I'm making less, he would give me a mortgage. So he goes, I just need a W-2 from you. So I went to these smaller banks and they're able to be more reasonable. They're able to look at the big picture and say, okay, you're making a nice consistent income. You have some rental income. You can easily cover this loan. Where, at the bigger banks, it's like, here are your boxes. And if you don't check all 5 or all 6, we're not going to lend you.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. I don't know if a lot of people understand that. It's the big brands are not always great for, getting what you need.
Exactly. So, let's see here. Oh, I've just been told, make sure you hit the like button if you're enjoying this show because it really helps us out. First name, last name is asking, is the 1031 still viable?
Yeah. So for those of you guys might not know what a 1031 is, a 1031 tax deferred exchange is something that's still that you can do. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to sell a property and put it into a exchange account so you can't touch the money. And then you have to identify, and there's time frames, you have to identify and close within a certain period of time and roll that money into a new property. So essentially, it's almost like a down payment for the next property. If you don't roll that money into a property that then you have to pay tax, just like anybody. And if you don't buy a property at or more than the price of the basis of the one that you're coming out of, then you have to pay tax on the difference, and that's called boot. So, but 1031s are still here. They're great.
Biden would like to he's mentioned getting rid of them, but a lot of let's be clear. A lot of presidents have mentioned getting rid of them. It sounds good to their audience. However, none of them have actually done it. So it will be interesting to see if he actually does anything about it.
Yeah, it's been around. I want to say the 1031 has been around for almost 100 years.
Yeah.
Something crazy like that. So I don't see it going away. It's a great way to upgrade and to roll into new stuff. There's a lot of mistakes people make around 1031s. The biggest one is that they rush into the next deal because they're trying to avoid tax. So there's a lot of people. So I've sold a couple properties this way, way overpriced. So sometimes if you get into a 1031 situation and you're scrambling to try to find a replacement, you oftentimes overpay for the next one. So you can't let the tax piece wag the dog. So which happens a lot. So make sure that if you do these, that you have that next deal in mind.
So a lot of questions are coming in on the crash, right? So, people are asking, when do you think it's going to be a buyer's market? Do you think 2022 is going to crash? Like what are you feeling right now in the atmosphere?
Yeah. So I think that we're already starting to see some markets soften. We're kind of talking about single family homes.
Yeah, single family.
So, the way to look at a market is obviously the amount of listings and the demand. So what pushes up a market is more demand than supply, period. That's it. So when you have a lot of people moving somewhere like Boise, Idaho, and there's only a limited number of supply, then, everybody thinks they're so smart. Look, my house is going up and my, the real estate salespeople are like, well, I'm so smart. Like we're selling things in a day or 2 days or 3 days. Has nothing to do with that. They're just ticket takers. There's more demand than supply, period. So what happens is when you start to see more listings and obviously more supply and less demand. So there's two things happening. One is you're definitely seeing less demand because of affordability. So I think you're going to start to see, like right now, the Southeast is going crazy. Florida, North Carolina. But there are areas that are reversing. Washington, D.C., Boise for sure. And
even Phoenix, we have friends that are realtors saying that things are sitting on the market.
Longer.
I'm looking at rentals, so I'm seeing price drops
Yep.
that I wasn't seeing a
Yep.
couple months ago.
Yep. So I talked to a friend yesterday, and his wife's digs into the MLS, and he's trying to buy rentals all the time. And he said he's seeing price drops all over the place. Now, that's healthy. There should be, trust me, there needs to be around a 6-month supply of housing in most markets for an equal balance. Now, maybe it's different in some markets, but and so I don't know that we're going to see a massive crash nationwide, but I do think you're going to see some things flip in individual markets.
It depends too a lot on what the government does as well. The stimulus
and the forbearance. The forbearance is kind of the next
forbearance.
piece, and nobody's really talking about that very much. But there are people that are behind on their mortgages, and a lot, and millions of them. And so I think what'll happen is they've gotten a lot of equity in their homes, and so I would expect that they're not going to be able to pay that. Like, you're talking about a fair amount of cash that they've been deferring. So, but I would also expect that most of those people are going to have that sitting in equity in their home. Right. So now that the forbearance is probably going to end here soon, and all this is kind of wrapping up, my guess is those listings are going to hit the market, and it's going to obviously grow the number of listings, grow the supply. And we'll see.
Yeah, definitely will. And just so you know, Ken has a new master course out, Buying Your First Rental Property. So right now we're offering $250 off of that course. So go check it out. So Chuck wanted to know, can you suggest a method to help a landlord determine the going market rent rate?
Sure. Yeah, it's easier than you think. So, you can obviously start with Zillow. Zillow does an okay job on figuring that out. And there's a bunch. Go to apartments.com. They've gotten into housing. There's a bunch of online services.
So Zillow, I haven't checked it out yet, but I just got a notification last week that they have a rental calculator now.
Yeah.
So I think they're trying to get a little bit better at that.
But the best thing, what happens is we don't really even use those. They're kind of guides. For how much is rent going up or going down. You really have to dig in. So the way to do it is to find your local property management folks or your local realtors in that particular submarket and find out what rents are going for. And, in every market that I've ever looked at, doesn't matter where it is, there's always a local, website or local, there's always local information. Now, right now we're out in Manhattan Beach, and I was digging around yesterday on what houses were renting for by the month, and there was at least 200 that were listed that were showing what the rents were. So they're everywhere, and it's really very, very easy to figure out what rents are.
Well, and plus, just coming from a small landlord, what I do is I just look at what other units are going for around me or in my buildings, and I kind of gauge it from there, right? There might be a $1,400 one and a $1,900 one, but the $19 one has been sitting for months on Zillow. I can see. So then I look at both units and kind of just gauge it, So there's that option too. That's how I do it.
Yeah.
Some people are commenting that the speed's a little bit slow. We apologize for that. We're in Manhattan Beach. The internet here is not as good as it is back at our studio.
I know.
We try though, you guys.
We'll be back soon.
Yeah. And then let's see. Sorry, I'm a little thrown off here. Oh, Kai said, Ken, did you get a 2.2% loan on a commercial loan? If so, how did you get that rate?
It's on a refinance on a property that we have already, and 10-year interest only, Fannie Mae.
Yep.
Very, very good loan. So we rate locked yesterday or the day before, and I got the notification.
You have a good relationship with the bank too. I'd have to assume that helps.
Yeah.
Bill has a really good question. He says, do you have any suggestions in dealing with rising property taxes? I see this as one of our biggest problems.
Yeah, he's right. Now, so this is an incredible question. And the reason is that there's already, you think about cities like San Francisco or New York or Seattle, where people are moving out. They're literally, and so what you have, think about what property taxes are for, and they aggregate up to a budget, and people leaving means that they're going to have to raise tax. So I think the next wave for property owners is going to be this issue, and I think that you really need to be careful on where property taxes are going. The tax assessor, the politicians, they're not going to cut expenses. So, they're going to look at homeowners and real estate owners as low-hanging fruit to pay their bills. And so there are, we appeal. There are ways to appeal your property taxes. We have a company that does that for us. And, we've won on a number of occasions over the years. But I think that this is something that you're going to really, really have to watch because and you really have to be careful of. And I don't, it's kind of a losing battle, I think. I think property taxes are going to be going up.
But rent goes up too.
Yes, it does.
So it helps to offset that.
Yep.
But that's why you don't want to be too tight on a cash flowing property, and you don't want to be at a property that's already not cash flowing because that could really make it worse.
But it used to be something that you just kind of, my partner and I, we actually were trying to buy a property in Austin, Texas, about 3 months ago. We are in escrow for one, but we actually calculated that by buying the property, it was going to increase our property tax expense by $100,000. So that was what we would have to pay more. And so it killed the deal. It actually killed the deal. It went from being a pretty decent cash flowing deal to, obviously it's $100,000 less a year. So we actually walked away from it because of the property tax increase. So that's something as a buyer you really need to look at.
Yeah, and just some comments here. Brian is saying in Louisville, and Cassandra is saying in Vegas, they're seeing price drops as well. You're going to start seeing that over a lot of the country because the demand, prices have just been crazy and everyone's just kept meeting the demand. Well, now we're kind of peaking to the point where it's just not meeting the demand in a lot of areas. And this is kind of what you see. You start to see some price cuts and some, things like that.
And what will happen, it'll be interesting to watch, guys. As people, let's say you list a home, obviously we've been in an incredible market. And like you list a home and you're like, and maybe you're a flipper, maybe you're a syndicator, whatever you are. Or maybe you're just a homeowner. If you're starting to see a price drop and longer delays and you have a lot of equity, then potentially what could happen is you're going to drop it even more because you're going to try to get that buyer. And so if that happens, you could start to see a competitiveness for the buyer and price drops, it kind of starts rolling down the road here.
Exactly. So JM has a good question. He said, what's your best advice for a first-time investment property? So a first-time investor, I guess.
Sure. So the best advice is to make sure that you're investing for cash flow and not for capital gain. So, we don't know where the markets are all heading, and they're all very, very fickle and all independent. So make sure that it cash flows and make sure it's in a place where people want to be. So that's the thing. Like people, sometimes they move to an area, and this is very common, especially for first time. They're always looking for the cheapest, and there's nothing wrong with that. I get it, but the cheapest might not necessarily, it might be also very, very hard to.
Right. Like,
to
it's going to be
manage.
harder to rent. It's going to be harder to find someone that wants to rent something that's way outside of town in the middle of nowhere versus in, the city center or by the city center. You just have to keep that in mind. But it's also going to be more expensive in those locations. But sometimes that's worth it because you're not going to have the vacancy and you're going to get more rent.
And you can do really well that way too. So there's nothing wrong with looking at those. Just make sure that you can fill them.
So Carrie's question, do you ever, I'll answer this one first because I've a soft spot for it. Do you ever prefer to keep utilities in your name as a landlord for an easier exit to the next tenant? And absolutely not. You don't want to be responsible for your tenants' bills.
Yeah, you don't. Yeah. So no, we always there are ways to. You can call the utility company, and there are ways to make it easier on the landlord as people move in and out. But you want the utilities, you want everything in the tenant's name. Otherwise, you're potentially going to be trying to collect those too.
Yeah, and you end up having to put them back in your name if you have an overlap. If somebody moves out, and the electric bill, and there's a 3-day gap, I have to put the electric back in my name for 3 days before it goes to the next tenant. So, and pay a few dollars. So, I mean, there is that, but it's just what you do. It's just part of it. So Felipe wants to know, what is the average net profit on a 1-door rental? He hears only 10%.
So if you're getting 10%, I think that's good. So there's nothing wrong with that. Your 10% net profit is actually a good number. So I don't know if that's the average. It depends on what you're buying. It depends on where. It depends on how much you pay. It depends on your debt. It depends on the expenses. There's a number of things that determine net profit. But I can assure you that if you're finding something that's 10%, you'll have plenty of money to invest.
Exactly. So Bill had a follow-up question to his tax question. He said, how can I keep the property taxes from rising? Is there anything that he can do?
Not really. No, I wish there was. There really is not. There are. The municipalities are always going to look at their expenses, and what you should do is you should dig into what makes up a property tax. Typically, you've got fire, police, probably your local schools, some of those kinds of things. So that's what property taxes are for. Obviously the list is bigger than that, but you need to dig into that. And, that's actually what you're battling against.
Darren had a question. He said, Ken, can you dive deeper with cap rates, how they're determined by brokers in the different markets and in the different classes of property,
Sure.
etc.?
So cap rates or capitalization rates are not actually determined by brokers at all. So a cap rate is a rate that it's basically the net operating income divided into the sales price. That's what it is. So cap rates are based on historical sales. Now, there's also cap rates that are estimated based on potential sales. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm buying a property right now and it has it has an NOI, whatever it is, whatever the seller is running that property for today, it has an NOI or net operating income, which is income minus expenses. There's a target number that the seller wants. There's a target number that the broker wants. So you can calculate a cap rate, obviously, based on a potential sale, but it's not an actual fixed cap rate until it's actually sold. So cap rates are really determined by sales, and and so they're thrown around a lot, but they're not really used to buy. There's a calculation when you buy, and so what you need to do is you need to look at the trend. And so typically low cap rates are going to be for, well located, main and main type properties. And then the higher cap rates are going to be, say, properties that are not as well located, And so you're almost always going to have the core, like I talked about with the REITs earlier, the core assets are always going to have the lower cap rates. It doesn't matter if it's multifamily, or it doesn't matter if it's an office or whatever it is. And also there, depending on the demand from the investor side, you could have low cap rates. Like industrial right now, or what they call last mile distribution. Think of Amazon, think of any of the warehouses on the outsides of town. That's the hottest market going right now. And so there's so much money pouring into that market, and cold storage, that cap rates are really, really, really low, because the investors are looking at the demand for that space. So, as everyone, wants their, whatever they order from Amazon, let's say, and they want it by 5:00. Well, that means it has to come from somewhere local. And so all that warehouse space all over the country is going crazy. I'm sure you guys have seen some of this warehouse space. So you're gonna start to see these lower cap rates, I think, on that kind of stuff. So cap rates go up when there's softness, and they go down when there's a lot of demand.
Nice. So Henry is asking, can I do a 1031 if I sell 2 rental units to buy 1 larger unit?
So the 1031 works on the tax ID number. So think of you can't aggregate a bunch of properties and then roll it into a 1031. So whatever your tax ID number is on a property that you sell actually goes into the exchange account, and that tax ID number actually buys the next property. So the tax ID number stays the same. So now it is a tax question, so I don't want to say no, but I think the answer is no, but I could be wrong. I don't think you can take a bunch of properties, put them into a 1031 and buy one. I think it has to be 1-to-1.
So Maria's question's interesting. She says, what do you think about Biden's proposal regarding taxing unrealized capital gains, and how can we plan for that if it passes?
Yeah.
Let's start. Do you think it's going to pass? Let's start there.
It'd be a tough one to pass, I think. Unrealized capital gains.
What you guys have to understand is the government needs private builders and investors investing in housing, because they don't have enough housing. So I feel like that sometimes they talk a big game, but I don't think that they would do it because it would hurt the investors too bad to want to build housing.
Well, you got to understand what an unrealized capital gain is. So think about what that would do to America. Like, look at how much money people just got during this housing run-up. That's an unrealized capital gain. So they would be taxing all those people based on that unrealized capital gain. So I don't think it'll pass.
Right. Like, for example, if your home went from $300,000 to $400,000 in the last year,
that's $100,000.
You'd be taxed on $100,000. So you basically owe the government, I don't know if it's 20% or what, but $20,000 that you'd have to then take out pay from your personal savings, which a lot of people don't even have.
Yeah. Just the word unrealized doesn't make sense to me. I mean, so.
And then if it goes back down, they don't care about that part.
That's the other issue. Is real estate does and will go up and down, and so I think it's a kind of a dicey issue. I don't think it's going to pass.
Yeah. Carrie said, "Have you had any luck cash flowing condos or townhomes given the high HOAs?"
Yeah, we have. The high HOAs are a concern. So an HOA, for those you might not know, is a homeowners association, HOA. And they typically have the common area expenses, and then you pay in monthly to a reserve account for capital, and then the HOA for their operational expenses. So I've seen HOAs as low as 100, actually lower. I've seen HOAs as high as 1,000. And I know in some cases, like high rises with, you think of like valet parking and rooftop pools and elevators and all that kind of stuff. You're going to have higher HOAs in a building like that, because those are all common area expenses. You actually have a piece of all the common area expenses. So it all goes back to rent. So I personally try to keep under $300 a month in HOA fees on or condos that I've purchased in the past, just because they can get away from you, and that's just my own internal rule.
Yeah, that's kind of mine too. Like my one condo fee is $300 and the other one's $220, and $300's like right at my breaking point. What I've noticed is a lot of the townhouses and condos that are, they have the tennis court and the restaurant and all, but then the HOA is like $800 a month. People don't really use those things. It's not going to be able to really get you more rent, or not $800 more rent. So really, I try to stay with just the more basic units. You had mentioned to me that the units that have hallways and elevators tend to be much more expensive because you have to air condition and heat the hallways. You have to maintain the hallways. You have to run the elevators. Where all my units are outward facing because we live in an area that's, nice weather. So I don't have to pay for the, all the hallways and the air conditioning, all the stuff, which makes the HOA a lot cheaper.
Yeah. So the configuration of the building, the landscaping, and also the age. So be very, very careful of the age. I've seen a lot of problems with this where people buy into an HOA and then they get, a massive bill for a roof replacement or painting of the whole property or whatever through a special assessment. So that's another, thing to take a look at. If you do buy into an HOA, you really got to get into what's called the reserve account. So there's two buckets of money. The bucket one is all the operational expenses. Think of common area water, common area electric, those kinds of things. Then the other bucket would be your CapEx or your capital expenses. So think of a roof or paint or parking lot or something like that. That's a non-operational expense. So you got to take a look at the reserve accounts and see what does this HOA have in reserves, because typically what happens in HOAs, the homeowners don't ever want increases. So, if it was 200 10 years ago, it's 200 today. Nobody's voting for increases, but everything's going up. And so what happens is typically the reserve accounts get depleted to pay for operations. And so, but doesn't mean that the building doesn't wear out. So then when you have to do a parking lot or you have to do, let's say, a painting or a roof, then what they do is they do a special assessment and hit all the people that own at the time.
And these can be a really big deal. Like my friends in Austin bought, and they didn't have many reserves in the HOA, and they were billed $7,000 for a big, pavement project. And then now they're hearing there could be another $7,000 assessment this year as well. So it's really important that when you're looking at the HOAs to make sure that they have the money in reserves and to look and see if there have been any special assessments or when the last one was. I know that the condo I just bought in December, I was looking at that, and, you don't want an HOA that keeps raising rates extremely. Like they usually raise them every year incrementally, but if there's a big raise in the HOA, that's a red flag. If they don't have money in reserves or they've been doing a lot of special assessments, that's a red flag too. And that's all part of your due diligence when you're, buying the condo.
Right. Just make sure typically condos pay their bills, typically their operational expenses, and they don't do a good job managing all the money that's necessary to maintain the property.
Yeah, definitely. But even on my small house, I have a single family and I have a small HOA there. I think it's like $90 a month because it maintains the pool and the lights outside, in everybody's front of their house. So you kind of have it everywhere too, even in single family. Well, guys, thank you for spending your Friday with us. I hope you have a nice weekend. Don't forget to check out the Master Course. It's $250 off, Master Course 2, buying your first rental property. And we will see you Monday.
Hey, guys, it's Friday. Enjoy your weekend.